wish to welcome you all to the 7th edition of the KOAFEC Ministerial Conference. I also wish to thank Their Excellencies, President Yoon Suk-yeol, the Prime Minister Han Duck-soo, the Deputy Prime Minister Soo Kyun-ho, and the government and the people of the Republic of Korea for inviting and hosting us for this very important conference. The KOAFEC conference is always an excellent opportunity to discuss progress on relations between Korea and Africa, development challenges and opportunities in Africa, and how we can continue to work together to accelerate the growth and development of Africa. And as you know, the conference holds every 2 years. The last time we met was in 2018 in Seoul, just ahead of the annual meetings of the African Development Bank Group. The COVID-19 pandemic did not make it possible to meet in 2020, so it is great to be able to all be together and to meet here physically. The focus of this KOAFEC ministerial meeting on just energy transition and agricultural transformation, as we've just heard from the Deputy Prime Minister, it's very pertinent to the development priorities of Africa and the global discourse on the Sustainable Development Goals. I wish to thank the government of Korea for its strong and consistent support to the African Development Bank Group. Korea strongly supported the general capital increase of the bank in 2019 and has made its first 3 capital subscriptions. It also pledged $105 million towards the 16th replenishment of the African Development Fund, its highest ever to date. Thank you very much. And the Korea Trust Fund and the $600 million Korea Africa Energy Investment Framework are directed towards supporting Africa in human capacity building and the development of the energy sector. As we meet, the world faces a number of challenges, including the tapering effects of the COVID-19 pandemic, eroded fiscal space for developing countries, heightened geopolitical risks from the Russian-Ukraine war, and its effects on rising energy and commodity prices. The tightening of monetary policies in Europe and the US have led to rising interest rates, which have in turn led to capital flight from emerging markets and increasing debt service payments, especially for African countries, with many facing high risks of debt distress. Yet on top of this comes the challenges posed by climate change, which is devastating African economies. Last week, the continent converged in Nairobi for the Africa Climate Summit. Africa, which accounts for just 3% of the global carbon emissions, suffers disproportionately from its negative consequences, losing $7 to $15 billion annually, and this could rise to $50 billion by 2030. Africa will need $2.3 trillion to meet its SDG goals by 2030. A major challenge will be about the access of millions of people to electricity. Currently, close to 600 million people do not have access to electricity. Now, much progress has been made since the African Development Bank Group launched its New Deal on energy in 2016. As the percentage of Africans with access to electricity actually increased from 35% to 56%, so a significant increase. Yet, there's still much to do. To achieve universal access to electricity, we must add 90 million people annually with access by 2030. And we must also add 130 million people annually to achieve universal access to clean cooking energy. And this is the most distressing for me, because I don't see why we should lose 300,000 people, women, every year, and all they're trying to do is to cook a decent meal for their families that we take for granted. And why another 300,000 kids on their backs should die from that, just because they're just trying to cook a meal for their family. And this is a big issue that we must collectively address. Your Excellencies, Africa has enormous renewable energy potential, including 11 terawatts of solar, the highest in the world, of which only 1% is utilized. 350 gigawatts of hydro, of which only 7% is utilized. 115 gigawatts of wind potential, of which only 2% is utilized. And 15 gigawatts of geothermal power, of which only 2% is utilized. Clearly, potential is important, but nobody eats potential. To reach universal access to electricity in Africa will require $23 billion annually until 2030. Achieving universal access to clean cooking energy will require $2.5 billion per year through 2030 for investments in liquefied petroleum gas, biogas fuel, ethanol, electric plates, and improved biomass stoves. According to the analysis of the International Energy Agency in a report which we launched in Nairobi just a week ago, and Professor Ndungu is here, and thank you very much, Governor, for hosting us there, we will need to distribute $250 million worth of cooking equipment to women by 2030. The African Development Bank is investing heavily in renewable energy, with a share of renewable energy in its power generation portfolio now standing at 87%. There is need to fully appreciate, however, that it will be impossible to provide universal access to electricity for Africa relying only on renewables. This is because of their high intermittency and variability, which negatively affects reliability for industrial use. As we therefore think of just energy transition, Africa must not be denied the opportunity to use its natural gas, which it now has in abundance discoveries. And just to be clear, this will not add to climate crisis at all. Rather, it will reduce emissions in Africa. Let's not forget that Africa's share of cumulative global carbon emissions since 1890 has only been 3%. According to the International Energy Agency, if Africa were to use up all its natural gas supplies for gas to power to complement its renewable energy, it would only add 0.5%, that's it, to total global emissions. So as we think about the whole issue of just energy transition, in context of what I just said about women not having access to clean cooking energy, for me, it's not just energy transition. It must be a compassionate energy transition. So using natural gas combined with renewable energy will assure Africa meets universal access to electricity while assuring net zero emissions. The bank is participating in the Just Energy Transition Partnerships in South Africa with the G7, and in Senegal, which they announced a $2.5 billion support. We're working closely with the European Union, the US, UK, Germany, and France. And through a $1 billion guarantee facility that we will be getting from the United Kingdom, the bank will support South Africa's Just Energy Transition Partnerships. We are also supporting efforts to develop more bankable projects through our NEPAD infrastructure project preparation facility, and of course, Africa 50. And that is why we have launched what's called the Alliance for Green Infrastructure in Africa, or AGIA, together with our partners to mobilize $500 million for project preparation on green infrastructure projects, and to be able to mobilize $10 billion for infrastructure projects, especially just for green stuff, greening Africa's infrastructure space. Now, let me now turn to agriculture. Your Excellencies, it is not acceptable that 283 million people are hungry in Africa. The number has worsened since the Russian-Ukraine war due to the pass-through effects of the high wheat and maize prices from supply disruptions of flows from Russia and Ukraine, both major suppliers to Africa. To mitigate these effects, the African Development Bank launched a $1.5 billion Africa Emergency Food Production Facility, which is currently supporting 20 million farmers in 34 countries to produce 38 million metric tons of food valued at 12 billion US dollars. Through our technologies for African agricultural transformation, that we like to call TAAT, we have provided 12 million farmers with high-yielding varieties and technologies that are doubling yields for maize, rice, wheat, and other crops. As a result of these efforts, I'm particularly delighted to say Ethiopia expanded area under heat-tolerant wheat varieties from just 5,000 hectares when we started there in 2018 to 2.8 million hectares by this year, achieving wheat self-sufficiency and becoming a net exporter of wheat. What an achievement. To build on that achievement, the Feed Africa Summit was held in January in Dakar under the chairmanship of His Excellency President Macky Sall. And this, in collaboration with the African Development Bank, is another major milestone in our drive to assure that Africa can feed itself and be fully self-sufficient, same way that you had the miracle of the Hunan River here in Korea. This summit attracted our attention, was attended by 34 heads of state and government, and it was hugely successful. The African Development Bank, working with global partners, we successfully mobilized $72 billion to implement the actions from this summit on the Food and Agriculture Delivery Compacts all across Africa, a landmark for this continent. Africa must be a solution to feeding the world, as it has 65% of the uncultivated arable land left to feed the world. So, in essence, what Africa does with agriculture will determine the future of food in the world. We may not be able to make aircrafts yet, and we will one day, but there's no reason why we should not be able to fill aircraft with food all over the world, given what we have in terms of land. I am very delighted, Deputy Prime Minister, with Korean government's K-Rice Belt initiative, which you mentioned in your address, which aims to help to produce 30 million metric tons of rice in 8 countries. Likewise, the African Development Bank has also launched a $650 million rice program that will support 15 African countries to produce 53 million metric tons of rice by 2025. This, in my view, Deputy Prime Minister, presents an excellent opportunity for Korea to work together with the African Development Bank on a Pan-African rice production initiative. Of course, this could be jointly announced next year during the Korea-Africa Summit. Together, let's use this KOAFEC conference to accelerate efforts towards mobilizing more support for achieving universal access to energy in Africa, advance a just energy transition, and turn the continent into a breadbasket for the world. Doing so will require additional resources. A key to achieving this is through the rechanneling of the special drawing rights, the SDRs, to the African Development Bank. The SDR rechanneling to multilateral development banks, which was actually developed by the African Development Bank, working in partnership with the Inter-American Development Bank, has shown very clearly that this rechanneling can actually allow the SDRs to be leveraged by 3 to 4 times. The critical point there is the leverage of 3 to 4 times. For example, a $10 billion allocation or rechanneling of the unused SDR by rich countries or wealthy countries that have SDRs that they don't really need it, to the African Development Bank on behalf of Africa can deliver easily up to $40 billion of support to Africa. Just imagine. So the SDR rechanneling approach comes at no cost to taxpayers. It has a zero risk of loss, and it preserves the reserve asset quality, a critical requirement by the IMF. So I'm very delighted that we've been able to do this. Now, what's now needed is for 5 SDR donor countries to form a group to provide the SDR rechanneling to the African Development Bank. And I would like to request, Mr. Deputy Prime Minister, that Korea considers joining other countries that have indicated a strong interest in rechallenging SDRs to the African Development Bank Group. This, in my view, will be a big game changer for Africa's development. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, Africa's future is certainly bright. And it will be brighter still with a stronger Korean-African partnership. Let's together accelerate Africa's growth and development. Let's succeed together. And of course, you were saying, Deputy Prime Minister, about the World Expo, which we strongly support. We all always like coming here. And so you have my personal support. I'm excited to always be here. You do great work around the world. Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup. Mucho obrigado. Shukran jaziran. Asante sana. Kamsha hamnida.